Hello! In this video, I am going to demonstrate launching from the surface and arriving at and docking with an orbital station in Flight of Nova. This is an update to an earlier video that I put out a couple months ago, and that video is still technically accurate, but there have been some major updates to the game, and I want to just release a new video talking about them. If you have not seen the old video, I recommend that you don't watch it because it is only useful now if you want to get to the high altitude stations. And that is one thing I just want to get out of the way quickly, that the new methods that have been added to the game to get to stations only work for the ones at 185 kilometers or 188 kilometers. For the higher stations, they don't work, but all of the missions in the game have you going to the ones at 185 kilometers anyway, so you don't need to go to the higher ones unless you want to just for fun, in which case you can follow the link in the description to my earlier video if you want a guide that works for those. If you do that, let me just give you a slight update to that video as well, because I only gave a orbital window for the 188 kilometer stations in that video, but there are others. For the stations at 450 kilometers, the separation should be about 5.5 degrees. For 750 kilometers, about 3 degrees. For about 1,000 kilometers or so, half a degree. And for the station that's at 3,000 kilometers, wait until it gets past you and is ahead of you by about 3.5 to 4.5 degrees. Depends on your how you launch. And that one is so high that the way you launch is really makes a big difference. So it's hard to give an exact number of degrees, but somewhere between 3 or 4 ahead of you. Also, I would recommend that for the stations at 180 kilometers, you do exactly what the game suggests that you do. It's pretty good, and it's only slightly slower than the method that I put out in the previous video, so if you watch that video, I'd recommend that you forget it for the stations at 188, because the new way that the game suggests that I'm gonna go over in this video is really good. But if you do still want to do it, if you're used to it, and it is slightly faster, then you can tell the UI to change this orbit launch rendezvous window by clicking on advanced mode and setting it to 600 kilometers. That will make it calculate the 6.5 degrees or so separation that I recommend in the other video. But since we're doing a training mission, this gets ignored and it's going to use the defaults, which are what I would suggest you keep them at anyway, unless you're very familiar with the other technique. So with all of that said, let's go ahead and run through this training mission. The biggest difference that we're going to see on the ground is that we are not separated from the equator. Latitude 0. We are right on the equator, and this is, I believe, a new land base that wasn't in the game before. It's right on the equator, and even the campaign missions, it's not just a training thing, even the campaign missions always have you launch directly from the equator, including from this base, which, by the way, has this cool arch building that's fun to fly through if you like doing that sort of thing. Another thing you can do here is time accelerate, which is extremely useful. You don't have to cancel the time acceleration, it will cancel itself at the right time, and in the training mission it will even automatically undock you. In the real thing, it won't do that. But as soon as that happens, you can launch and then point up a little bit towards this diamond in the sky and transition to cruise mode, and we are just going to burn at full throttle and go towards that waymark. And that is literally all you have to do to get started in your orbit. There is a little bit more to it once you get past that waymark. But in this first part, until we get there, just keep your prograde vector pointed at the waymark. By the way, if you're not familiar with it, let me just switch to this view. Oh, we don't have a retrograde vector yet. That blue symbol with the up, left, and right lines is called a prograde vector or indicator or something like that. I usually say vector. And it's just where we're going. It's the direction that the ship is going. There's another similar one that's the same circle, but it's got a X through it, and that's called retrograde. That's the opposite of the direction we're going. And we get this text that says, turn off the engine immediately, but that's just to help people who are need to read through the text. We don't need to do that. We just know, wait until our apoapsis is 185, and then let go of the engine. So the apoapsis is now nicely surrounded with this red box. That's what I did. I waited until it was 185 or so, and then killed the engine. Did I get a retrograde vector yet? Yeah, there it is. That's what retrograde looks like. So if you burn towards that, in most situations, you'll raise your apoapsis. And if you burn towards that, in most situations, you'll lower it. The game basically recommends to do the following things. Get your apoapsis near 185K, wait until you get to your apoapsis, and then burn horizontally, that is, keep your FPA close to 0 until you reach 7,800 meters per second or so. Now, just to demonstrate this, I'm going to burn. The atmosphere has killed a little bit of my velocity, so my apoapsis has dropped. I'm going to just burn towards prograde a little bit more to get it back up above 185. And the other thing we can do while we're waiting, if you look in the top right corner, we get 4 little simplified orbital parameters, which is quite nice. You don't have to look around at all the displays and everything. You just look there and make all the lines green. Our inclination is the only one that we really can affect right now, and it is not exactly 0. So I'm just going to use the RCS translate left button to move us towards 0 so that that inclination is perfect. As long as you keep it green, it's fine really, but since we have nothing else to do right now, I'm just using the time to get the inclination better. And you can see our altitude is getting pretty close to the green range as well. And the altitude and FPA are linked in this case because when your craft is at its apoapsis, then by definition the FPA, the flight path angle, will be 0 because you'll be parallel with the ground for that moment. As we approach our apoapsis, I just want to add one nice suggestion, I think, to these guidelines. The game says, wait until you reach a 185 kilometers altitude and then burn prograde. And if you did everything else exactly perfectly, then that always works. But in order to make things easier, if you didn't do something earlier exactly perfectly, then it is really helpful, in my opinion, to look at this little upper screen and find the station that you want to go to. In this case, that is Becca. And right now, that station is 425.9 kilometers away from us. And my recommendation, in addition to these steps, is regardless of anything else, whatever your apoapsis is and whether you're there and what your flight path angle and all of that is, don't start your orbital insertion burn. Don't start your engines back up until this number here is between 2 and 300. So, put another way, if you see that this number has gone below 200, but you have not yet gone up to your apoapsis, you're still below it and waiting, don't wait anymore. Start your orbital insertion right there as soon as it goes below 200 kilometers because the station is too close to you. And you need to start gaining velocity. On the other hand, if you're already at your apoapsis and starting to fall back down, but this range is still above 300 kilometers, then just wait and lose a little altitude. You'll fall down a little bit, but unless you're really far off, you've got lots of time to wait for this to drop below 300 kilometers and then start your burn. But ideally, it'll be somewhere right in that range at the time that you get to an FPA of 0. And we'll see if that works out for me this time. My FPA is approaching 0. And just to reiterate what this is saying, what it means is you want to be pointing directly east, so in left and right, the same plane as the prograde vector is, and also the same plane as these other stations. You can sort of see that. But you can point up and down in order to keep this FPA number close to 0. So while we're doing our burn, that's our job, is to point up and down only in order to keep that FPA close to 0. And we can see that actually it's going to be pretty good right in the middle of that range that I was talking about 260. So as our FPA crosses 0, I started burning the engines, and it's dropping. So I'm going to point us up a bit in order to raise that FPA up again. And by keeping the FPA at 0, what we're doing is keeping ourselves at our apoapsis. So we're making the current point our apoapsis, or at least relatively close to it, while raising our periapsis. You can see that that's coming up and up, and ideally we do want those two numbers to both be 185. So our FPA is now above 0. So I'm going to angle back down. All you have to do, you don't have to worry about the apoapsis and periapsis. Don't think about that right now. Just look at FPA, and there we go. So technically our periapsis is still negative, so we're not actually in orbit yet, but we're so close to it that it doesn't matter. We're going to arrive at the station before we fall back down into the atmosphere. And we get this green text that says, "Good luck reaching the station," and if we pause, then we get some good advice, which is to take things slowly and don't rush. And I very much agree with that, at least for the first several times that you try to reach an orbital station. There is absolutely no reason to rush. But let's just turn around now and take a look at the station. Real quick, I should mention that it's not always going to be right behind you. It might have passed you and end up in front of you. It might be slightly above or below you. So you might have to look around for it. And of course, you can always use the external view if that helps find it. But yeah, we can see here that our relative velocity, which is that green number, RV, is 110 meters per second. And importantly, it is green and negative. If it's not green and negative, then the station is moving away from you, and you do have to do something to fix that. And the easy rule of thumb there is that a wider, bigger curve, if you're driving around a curve and you go towards the outside, that's going to take longer because you've got longer distance to travel. So orbits are the same way. If you're higher up away from the planet, then you orbit slower. And if you're lower down towards the planet, then you orbit faster. And so if your orbit is circular, then the station will catch up to you if you're below it. So if the station is behind you, then go below the station and it will catch up to you. If the station is ahead of you and you need to catch up to it, then go below it and you'll catch up to it. The reason that doesn't seem to be the case right now is because, as you can see, I'm not actually in a circular orbit. I'm slightly off circular, and so that rule doesn't completely apply. If I wanted it to apply to me, I could just burn towards prograde a little bit more so that my periapsis matches my apoapsis and it's circular. But there is no real need to do that because we're close to the station, so we don't need to worry about those sorts of things. That would only really be necessary if we were hundreds of kilometers away from the station, and we're much closer than that, so we can pretty much just go directly towards it. We don't have to worry about all of that orbital mechanics stuff. And the way to point yourself at something, once you're within 80 kilometers of it, the game gives you this yellow circle that says local. And that's not a mysterious symbol at all. It's literally just where you're going. So we are moving towards that yellow circle. And therefore, obviously, I want to go to the station, so I want the yellow circle to be pointing at the station. And so right now I'm holding the RCS translate up and translate left buttons in order to move that point on top of the station. Now just up. You can also use the main engines for this, but as I was just saying, there's no rush. You may as well just use the RCS. Unless you're in a hurry to get there, you can just use the RCS for this. And you will get there. And there we go. You don't have to look at any of the other numbers. You don't have to look at these displays. All you have to do is look at the HUD now. All the information that you care about is on the HUD. Your distance, relative velocity, and this local vector is pointing at the blue diamond. Of course, you only get the blue diamond in the training missions, but you do, in real missions, still have the station in sight, and so you just point the vector at that. If you get impatient, you can use the RCS thrust forward to increase your velocity to about 200 meters per second. I would say that within 200 meters per second is sort of safe. So if you're following the advice of slow and steady, slow in this case is a relative term. 200 meters per second is pretty slow when you're in orbit. So I say increase this up to 200 meters per second if you'd like to make this wait a little bit shorter. You can of course do more than that if you're comfortable with it, but I would recommend leaving that until you've docked with the stations a few times and you've got used to these sorts of things. But 200 meters per second is pretty tame. You can usually correct any mistakes that might come about when you're that slow pretty easily, and you won't do something unfortunate like accidentally crash into the station or skip past it and not be able to get back to it. Later on, when you do want to use the main engines to do these sorts of last stage, final approach sort of maneuvers, this lower screen here is quite useful because even if you're looking away from the station, you can still see your relative velocity and distance to the station. And I'll just use the external view real quick to point out there is a anti-local vector which points exactly opposite the local vector. You can ignore that until you are more familiar with doing these sorts of maneuvers. But what that is I mean, in addition to being exactly opposite the local vector, it's the direction you should burn in order to kill your velocity relative to the station. But you don't need to know that right now. For now, we're drifting towards the station, and because we're both in different orbits, our local vector is going to sort of drift away from the station over time, and so our job during this coasting phase is to just watch that and make sure that it stays over the station. Or in this case, over this green diamond, blue diamond. And to be safe, when we're within 15 kilometers or so, if we're at 200 meters per second, then we can start slowing down. Using the RCS reverse thrust to do that. And just keep tweaking the position of your local vector to make sure that it stays over where you want to go. And I will point out that in case you're wondering, technically, since we're burning the engines on the front of the ship, that means we are burning towards anti-local, just in case that's helpful to know that. But you don't really have to care, just keep the local vector, this yellow circle, pointed at the blue diamond, and hold reverse thrust. And that's really all you have to do. And when we get close enough, then we get a new checkpoint in the training mission. think we are actually going to overshoot this a little bit, but that's fine. That'll just demonstrate what to do in that case. Now, of course, you could use the main engines. To stop. But you don't need to. Just keep holding back until the relative velocity shown on that lower screen gets back to 0. I'd like to say this is a good example of what not to do. Maybe start slowing down at 20 kilometers instead of 15 would have been better. So our relative velocity is back below 0, and we can just turn around back towards the station again. And RCS burn forward. And the same applies to our local vector. Just point that where we want to go. Notice that I'm not pointing it directly at the diamond anymore because I don't want to crash into the docking port. I want to position myself for docking. Which means being in front of the docking port. So that's where I'm pointing my local vector at. And we know which way it's oriented now since we saw it earlier. So we can just sort of start getting angled the right way. Let's just rotate ourselves around so that we have to do less work once we actually get there. Slow and steady is good advice here. If you accidentally tap the main engines, you can really mess yourself up if you aren't expecting it. So I'd recommend taking your hand off the throttle or off your throttle button or whatever you have, and just use the RCS through this whole process. That's why I didn't use the main engines to stop back there when we overshot. And that made this take a little bit longer, but that's totally fine. As the help text says, there's no rush. So what I like to do here is sort of stop relative to the docking port and just sort of visually align myself with it. Use my eyeballs to see where I should be. Relatively speaking. And then once I've done that, then switch to this upper camera and complete the docking maneuver by using this guidance. Slow and steady still. And here we go, all docked and completed. And those principles apply just exactly the same during the campaign missions as well, and most of them apply in free mode. The only thing that you don't get is the diamond in the sky during free mode, but you can sort of figure out where it is by doing it several times in the training and then just aim for that same general area. Or if you like, you can use the sort of beginning part of my previous video and then use the green lines and such that have been added to finish the orbit. Both of those ways work. Anyway, I hope that this has been helpful, and I hope that you have fun and good luck docking.